Good morning all. In this video I want to attempt to identify a few more justifications that are often given for the range of inequalities that Kozol points out in his text, and to discuss or highlight some proposed solutions or attempts to resolve some of the problems that Kozol points out in his text. And getting at these two tasks, I want to start with the Kozol assignment. If you look at the assignment, it reads this way: identify, explain, and evaluate, that is, weigh the merits of, two rationales expressed in Kozol's The Shame of the Nation that are used to justify the gross socioeconomic inequalities manifested in public education. Your explanation should detail specifically the range of inequalities at issue and how these two rationales attempt to legitimize inequality as just. Your evaluation should measure the value of these ideas in the context of a democratic society. By all means, be specific and thorough. Now, I'll break this down in a more simplistic way. You are to do three things. First of all, give the reader a sense of the range or scope of inequalities that are identified throughout Kozol's text. I'm not talking one or two inequalities. I'm talking about the range of inequalities. What you're doing is setting the context. What is that issue here? What is this debate over? Well, it's over inequities and inequalities as manifested in public education, in and between public schools. So you want to give the reader a concrete sense of that range. Give the reader examples, and those examples range from inadequate curriculum materials, inadequate facilities, school buildings in disrepair, water coming through the light sockets, no heat, no air conditioning, sewage backing up in the toilets, curriculum materials, if they have any at all, completely out of date, 20 years, 30 years out of date, while other schools have the plushest of plush facilities, the most up-to-date technological equipment, up-to-date curriculum materials. There's differences in teacher quality, teacher turnover, teacher quality, teacher pay. There's differences in our inequalities and inequities in per pupil spending. That gets at the range, and furthermore, there's a difference in educational experience of educational experience, opportunities afforded to students. So when I say give the reader a sense of the context that is attempted to be legitimized, you are giving the reader a sense of the range of inequalities at issue. Not just one or two inequalities, but the range of inequalities and inequities that Kozol points out in the text. Secondly, you are to explain two ways by which Americans attempt to justify, that is, they attempt to argue that the conditions are fair, right, just. You're not attempting to explain how and why these conditions come about. That's important, but that's something separate from what I'm asking you here. I'm asking you to explain how is it that Americans, while recognizing that the range of inequalities exist, turn around and say, yep, this is fair. This is the way it ought to be. This is just. That's what justification, or to justify, means: to prove or show to be right or reasonable, fair. And we'll go over some of those. We'll identify a few of those justifications that we've talked about in the previous, or I identified in the previous video, and then a few more. And then thirdly, the third task of the assignment is to evaluate, weigh, measure those two justifications. Do you agree with them? Do you agree with them, or not. Why and why not? And that's your task. This paper, again, whatever style manual style you use, be consistent with it. This paper will take you, probably 5 to 7 pages. There are more moving parts in this assignment than there was in the spring assignment. So I would imagine that it will take, just depending on how concisely you write, 5 to 7 pages to complete this task. By all means, be thorough and explicit when spelling out those justifications. You want to spell out the logic entailed, including the assumptions upon which those justifications rest. That is, it's not good enough to simply say or to state in the paper. Some people believe that that money is not going to solve this problem, and in fact, that is one justification. Money's not going to solve this problem, people argue. Governor, Tommy Thompson of Illinois once said, the governor talking about the people of East St. Louis, money's not going to solve this problem. The problem with East St. Louis, he maintained, is with the people. They have money. We have given them money, the state, he argues, and they squandered it. In turn, implying that, or the assumption is that the problem is inherent with the people. So it's not good enough to simply state, well, some believe that, for instance, high stakes testing as embodied or expressed through No Child Left Behind will take care of the problem, and they leave it at that. Spell that out. What you need to do is spell that out more thoroughly, including the assumptions upon which these justifications rest. In other words, don't simply make one statement and leave it at that, as if you have that one statement is not an explanation, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So what you want to do is identify what the justification is as a justification. Be explicit. Some people argue, or some people attempt to justify this range of inequalities this way, and then explain it, and then go to the next justification. Again, one statement does not constitute an explanation. What I also don't want to see, though this was hardly an issue in the previous paper, is a string of quotations that, quotations don't speak for themselves. They have to be explicated, interpreted. So do not construct papers simply by stringing quotations from the text and then citing those quotations. That's not addressing the task. Now, what are some of the justifications? I identified some of those justifications last time. We've talked about the range of inequalities and inequities. The Kozol in the back of the text gives you a sense throughout the text, but also there's some appendices in the back or some charts in the back that give you a sense of the difference in teacher pay, per pupil spending. We've talked about the physical inequalities, that is the physical facilities, the facility inequalities. I think I've mentioned those last time. And then curriculum material inequalities. I mentioned some of those. And of course the book is replete with them. But some of the justifications, as Kozol would identify these, would be blaming the victim, so to speak. I started last time with a quotation from the political scientist Lawrence Mead, who maintained that if poor people would simply behave rationally, they wouldn't be poor for very long. There are those, such as Tommy Thompson, who have argued that the problem is with the people. It's an inherent personal trouble that manifests itself as a social problem, but is really the root source is with the people themselves. The assumption is, of course, at root, I guess you could say that such a statement rests upon the idea that poverty, or is associated with the idea that poverty is symptomatic of some deeper personal character, genetic or cultural flaw. That's how some people look at this issue. Poverty is simply a matter of simply a matter of people not having the wit, intelligence, energy to make their way in the world, and thus this is their situation is the result, symptomatic of some deeper personal flaw. There are those who have made the argument, and what they'll point to is, look, if, and I'll get to this in a minute as a justification, but look, insofar as that we have allowed, everybody has an equal go at a public school, particularly through vouchers and magnet systems, and parents don't take the initiative to get their students in better situations, well, they only have themselves to blame. There are those who are sympathetic. Second justification we identified last time, there are those who are sympathetic with Kozol's concern here, who argue that, look, the current rates of segregation or manifestations of segregation, and thus rates of inequalities and inequities manifested in public schools, are a result of individuals, an unfortunate result of individuals exercising their democratic right to choose where to live. Everybody has equal rights, equal choice, and anyone can choose anywhere they want to live. They argue. So Kozol would argue that, well, that's a justification. It assumes that everyone has equal economic power and thus are capable of making equal choices, equal opportunity to make such choices. Kozol would also point out, I've identified this last time. Kozol pointed out that educational policies such as No Child Left Behind, that brought in high stakes testing, assumed that we did not need our schools. The problem with schools and school inequity and inequality was not so much that, as measured by outcome, was not didn't require a large sums of money. As one of the presidents once said, you don't keep pumping gas into an already flooded engine. What schools need is high expectations, highly qualified teachers, and consequences to ensure that those highly qualified individuals bring about the goals inherent in those high expectations. And of course, as noted last time, what high stakes testing often does, to use Wayne All's and others' idea, it often punishes poor people for being poor. That is, again, I'm recapping what we said last time. What high stakes testing, as manifested as expressed through or put into effect through No Child Left Behind, Race to the Top, did was it just simply exacerbated the unequal educational experiences of students according to class, socioeconomic class of schools. Insofar as schools that fail to make adequate yearly progress tend to be schools located in low SES neighborhoods. Therefore, there's an incentive for those schools to avoid the consequences, being shut down, going into receivership, teacher assignment, principal assignment, administrative assignment, public perception, funds attached to performance, and so on. And so what often happens in those contexts is that the school administration, school administrators and teachers will focus on teaching to the test, so to speak. That is, in maximizing test performance so as to avoid such consequences. This often turns into a training situation, a condition response situation that is not the same as education. that you would often find in conditions or school conditions that have not failed or that have met adequate yearly progress each year. We talked about that. Kozol would argue that such a policy, while perhaps good in intention, first of all, does not address the root issue. Well, one being inequality and inequity in funding, and then two, we know why students, in terms of that policy punishing the poor, we know exactly why people who are poor in material conditions do poorly in school, often do poorly in school, not always. How it affects student performance. We've known this for the eons, since the 1920s. I was even before that. Having access, and if you need research, research for this, quantitative as well as qualitative, it's there. NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which houses the educational statistics data, points out time and time again the direct correlation or the strong correlation between socioeconomic class and student performance as measured by high stakes testing. We've known for a long period of time that having access to human resources, material resources outside the home, outside of the school, that is, in one's home life and socioeconomic circumstance, is greatly impactful on students' academic performance. Kozol would say that simply it gives things such as no Child Left Behind, high stakes tests, such federal policy as No Child Left Behind gives the impression that the federal government is addressing these issues when in effect such policies is simply exacerbating the problem. Now, Race to the Top did have one advantage over No Child Left Behind insofar as it set aside or designated money, special money for community schools. It did recognize that the context outside of schools, the socioeconomic circumstances, did factor into and play a part in school success. In students' academic success. And so it set aside money for schools to become community centers. Now, that's an old idea that dates back to Jane Addams and Hull House in the first schools, or the early 1900s schools expanding its social functions. Nevertheless, the voucher system and magnet schools, again, Kozol would say those are good insofar as they go, but they do not get at the root source of inequality and inequity. And then for those who can't, for whatever reason, and again, as he points out, he's using figures from Gary Orfield's The Civil Rights Project. Only 1%, and NAEP is, by the way, only 1% of the millions of students who qualify for a voucher system actually exercise their voucher option. Then the voucher and choice mechanism, the voucher system, and the magnet schools do not address the problems that kids who are still stuck in bad situations face. It's almost as if, those schools can be completely written off as long as parents have a choice mechanism. And again, he would say those are good, those are fine insofar as they go, because it allows individuals who can get their children into better situations. But again, it doesn't solve the problem. It doesn't get at the root source of the problem, and thus it gives the public the sense that the federal government and state governments are attempting to address the issue, and perhaps they are, but in effect, they aren't. In consequence. There are those who, I'm just running through justifications. Look, money doesn't matter. You're pouring good money down a hole. Money is not the difference. These kids, you can pour tons of money into this, into equalizing and equitably funding schools, but some students simply aren't going to take advantage of the opportunities afforded. They can't, given who they are or where they come from, um, or and so on. Again, that would lead Kozol to say, that doesn't mean we shouldn't try. We don't have an ethical or a moral obligation to at least attempt to provide them equal educational opportunities, materials, good teachers, and so forth. That doesn't absolve us from that moral responsibility. There are those who argue, look, I don't want bad things to happen to children, across the district, but I want my tax dollars staying in my community to serve my community. Uh, we've since the 1920s, we've agreed to fund schools based on local property taxes, and again, I don't want my local property taxes, some will say, going to other communities. I want it to serve my own. There are those who argue that, look, we probably should equalize schools, desegregate schools, certainly equalize and provide equity, financial equity to schools. And we can desegregate schools, but look, as they argue, as some argue, the old cliche, again, it's cliche, and stereotyping, actually, frankly, you can take the child out of the ghetto, but you can't take the ghetto out of the child, or in my particular case, you can take the child out of the trailer park. That's where I came from, but you can't take the trailer park out of the child. Again, those types of statements mask or express, not mask, but express justifications for inequality, the range of inequality. Why do anything? I mean, you can go ahead, but you're just wasting your time, so to speak. Good gracious, I could be missing some things here. Okay. There is. Let me run through my notes here so I don't. I apologize. It's not our responsibility to pay our tax. Okay, we're good with that. Let me next go to a criticism. It's often a common criticism of Kozol's, and this will lead me to one more justification, but just bear with me. It's often said that Kozol focuses too much on, gives too much efficacy to the. He puts too much on the school. He gives too much efficacy to the school, and not enough to family backgrounds, the social conditions from which children come, that schools have to address. The argument often runs against Kozol, or criticism of Kozol often runs, look, you put too much importance on the function of the school to change people's life chances, and then in turn you ignore the social circumstances from which they come. Is that true of Kozol? I would ask in a face-to-face course, and I'm asking you all now, do you think that's true, that Kozol places too much emphasis on the power of schooling and not enough on other institutions that need to change in order to meet these problems? Well, Kozol, in his defense, and I would agree with him on this matter, writes this: the point is often made that even with genuine equality of schooling for poor children, other forces would still militate against their school performance. Cultural and economic factors in the flight of middle-income blacks and Hispanics from inner cities still would have their consequences in the heightened concentration of the poorest children in the poorest neighborhoods. Teenage pregnancy, drug use, and other problems would still render many families in these neighborhoods all but dysfunctional. Nothing I have said within this book should leave the misimpression that I do not think these factors are enormously important. A polarization of this issue, whereby some insist upon the primacy of school, others upon the primacy of family and neighborhood, obscures the fact that both are elemental forces in the lives of children. The family, however, differs from the school in the significant respect that government is not responsible, or at least not directly responsible, for the inequalities of family background. It is responsible for inequalities in public education. So Kozol was focused, it's not that he ignores socioeconomic background and context as an element in students' performance, school performance. But his emphasis is on the inequalities found and inequities found in public schools. But it still leaves us with having to account for socioeconomic class. It's something that Kozol, again, would not deny. He sees the importance of social class, one's family, socioeconomic background. But how do you address that? What is class? What is the mechanism by which class reproduces itself? How does class create open worldviews or closed worldviews? Open worldview, a high degree of self-efficacy. I matter, I can, I have power backed up in material, but also the mindset, I can create change in times of conflict, that is power. Or lack of material goods, such that one resigns, a low degree of self-efficacy, a closed worldview. I do not matter. What's the use? I do not have the power to create change in times of conflict. How does class create that? What's the mechanism by which objective circumstances creates worldview, which in turn, when put into concrete action, tends to come right back around to create the very circumstances, material circumstances that created or influenced the worldview to emerge to begin with. That understanding that mechanism is important for school teachers, because ultimately our work is to affect worldview, sense of self-efficacy, so to speak. So understanding social class is important to all educators, and that should be 2 or 3 classes. Ultimately, though you get none. You have me on a virtual, whatever we call this, indicating the class is important. But you should have an entire semester related to education and social class for sure. But unfortunately, colleges of education around the country have dissolved their social foundations programs, and thus such emphasis is, of course, de-emphasized. But even Kozol would have to deal with even people who are concerned with this issue will have to understand something about social class and deal with social class. Again, people spend entire careers dealing with this issue. But let me go to the James Coleman report, which is called, good gracious, Equality of Educational Opportunity. Yeah, Equality of Educational Opportunity is the Coleman report. You simply type in a Google search, Equality of Educational Opportunity. I'm sure there's a PDF. I haven't looked, but I'm sure there is, which was published in 1966 by the U.S. U.S. Government Printing Office, D.C. Again, it was a government-sponsored, federal government-sponsored piece of research. 1964, he interviewed 645,000 children, 60,000 teachers, and roughly 4,000 schools across the country. Students in grades 1, 3, 6, 9, and 12. 1, 3, 6, 9, and 12 were given a battery of tests designed to measure achievement in reading, writing, calculating, and problem solving. And then the research, I'm sure the research would have said something different had, he looked at intelligence, creativity, and moral development. But Kozol defended measuring students' abilities to achievement in reading, writing, calculating, problem solving, because he said that those were the necessary basic skills, or the basic skills necessary for full participation in the increasingly technological world in which we live. Back to what is minimal, basic. He then wrote up his findings and then, of course, engaged in a range of qualitative research as well, but interviewing students, ethnographic types of research. But he wrote his findings up under headings. For instance, achievement scores. Again, most of the things that Coleman finds we had known for quite some time. Minority students generally enter school at an academic disadvantage. Achievement scores for the average, we're talking average American, American Indian, Mexican American, Puerto Rican American, African American were lower than those of average white or Asian American students. Again, a second finding, which confirms previous research, was that the gap separating achievement scores of minority and majority students widened as students progressed through school. That is, there's a snowball effect. Again, we'll come back to that. Coleman thought that he knew why, that there was a great difference in school characteristics, and there were, but he wanted to see. So he looked at factors and differences. He looked at factors and the differences in these factors between schools. Age of school building, access to chemistry, physics, and language laboratories, library facilities, the number of textbooks, average class size, per pupil expenditure, teacher background, characteristics such as education and test scores. And Coleman maintained that although differences were found between schools, for blacks and whites, for instance, the disparities were small and not always in favor of the schools for whites. More significantly, none of the differences appear to explain the disparity between the achievement scores of blacks and whites, for instance. Surprisingly, class size, per pupil expenditures, school facilities, and varied curricular offerings had virtually no impact on academic achievement. However, under the subtitle, The Influence of the Home, Coleman writes this, and this is the famous paragraph out of this entire report that sent educators, academics, those concerned with public schools into a frenzy. It set off a host of research and reports dealing with social class. Coleman writes this under the influence of the home. One implication stands out above all, that schools bring little influence to bear on the child's achievement that is independent of his background and general social context, and that this very lack of an independent effect means that the inequalities imposed on children by their home, neighborhood, and peer environment are carried along to become the inequalities with which they confront adult life at the end of school. For equality of educational opportunity to the school must imply a strong effect of schools that is independent of the child's immediate social environment, and that strong independent effect is not present in American schools. And that educators immediately jumped to I wouldn't say jumped to the conclusion. It led them to believe that Coleman was suggesting that they do not matter. They can't influence or change the life chances or opportunities of their students, and therefore, what's the use? And that ran counter to most educators' experience. They knew that they did make a difference. This is on an anecdotal level. They knew via their own experience that they mattered, that they did have some influence on children, their worldviews, their skills, the development of skills, basic skills, and ability to think critically and so forth, and simply couldn't accept it. Again, it sent off a host of research, people attempting to replicate Coleman's research. Something had to go wrong. had to be amiss, wrong. One such academic was called Christopher Jinks. I think this is 1973. Christopher Jinks. You can see this. I'm sorry, I don't have a board. If I got a little bit better at editing such videos here, I could embed this right into this video, but there's not enough time. I gotta fish. Christopher Jinks, in a book titled Inequality. Christopher Jinks replicated who could not believe Coleman's findings. Something had to be wrong. He knew that he had had an effect on children and so forth. Gathered a high-profile team of statisticians, qualitative researchers, and didn't go into the same exact schools that Coleman went into, but replicated it. But roughly 4,000 schools, 600,000 students, 60,000 roughly there, give or take. You can look at his research, teachers, and basically came to the same conclusion, a little bit stronger conclusion than what Coleman came up with. Jinks maintained anything short of a massive redistribution of wealth in American society would not affect the life chances of children, particularly among poor children, at all. Again, a frenzy of academic research, practical research related to education and socioeconomic class began to emerge strongly. Again, really hard to replicate that one day discussion that I always had in a face-to-face class, wherein I go through class, define socioeconomic class, the mechanism by which class reproduces itself, work through education's role in replicating social class. Again, that's important. The reproduction of social class through the institution of schooling has a long history in terms of research, and you just simply type in reproduction, socioeconomic class, and schooling, you will come across such research. Samuel Bowles and Herbert Gentis, in a book called Schooling for Capitalist America, something like that, published in the 1970s, 1972, 73, something like that, makes the argument that American public schools, from the beginning, American public schools is a mechanism by which to reproduce socioeconomic class. There's nothing new in that argument. It's an old Marxist argument, or critical theorist Marxist argument, that our institutions merely reflect the prevailing norms. That when I say prevailing, that is the most powerful, those who hold power. They merely perpetuate the prevailing norms, expectations, and standards necessary to prop up those in power. But that also suggests that there is no human agency within those institutions, and that's certainly not the case. So that one day discussion that I was able to have in class, we enabled me or allow me to work through and give students some suggestion as to how schooling and teachers, unconsciously of course, work to reproduce social class, or at least a closed worldview, which in turn leads to a reinforcement of class, but also what schools can do to transform socioeconomic class. We don't have that. There's no sense in giving it a video here. I mean, if you are at all interested in this issue, by all means come and see me. We can engage in all types of research, whether that be philosophical, sociological, If you have any interest, just let me know. Just let me know. I'm going to skip it and get right to and go to what are some proposed, I want to say resolutions, but there is no surefire way to solve the issue of socioeconomic class in and through schooling. I mean, if there is, you find out what it is. We'll make a video. Like I always tell students, we'll make a video, and I will retire. But again, I mean, no one solved this riddle of socioeconomic class, and in a capitalist society, it's. I mean, the metabolic, the metabolism of a capitalist society requires a degree of inequality in order to grow for profit, to compound profit. That's a discussion for another time. But what are some proposed? What does Kozol offer any suggestions as to how to, I don't want to say mitigate, but attempt to, mitigate some of these problems that he's identified, and he does. At least is suggestive, and then there are a couple of others I need to draw your attention to. Kozol points out again, he's drawn on Gary Orfield and Susan Eaton's work, but Gary Orfield maintained that one obvious way to get at these problems is to bus students. I mean, as whether you agree with it or not, I'm just reporting. Orfield argued that busing was never really tried. As a result of by 1972, the Mecklenburg case with all deliberate speed, desegregated schools with all deliberate speed, school districts drug their heels. I don't know if you drag your heels or not. Delayed integrating schools as best they could, I guess. And of course, with the Mecklenburg case, the Charlotte Mecklenburg County case in 72? I'm screwing up dates. One result of that, one solution, practical solution, of course, would be to integrate schools and provide federal state funds to bus students, so as to make that possible. As Orfield points out, almost as soon as it started, opponents came out of the woodwork to block it and to get rid of those policies. Already by 1977 in, I forget what, was it Oklahoma or Missouri? I'm screwing this up. Already by 1977, there were policies put in place in a couple of cities across the country to stop busing, making the argument, I think it may have been Missouri versus Jenkins, but I'm not sure, in that particular case, Kansas City, to stop busing. By 1977, arguing that we've done all we could do to create a unitary school district. Certainly by 1984, and then certainly by 1993, in 1984, really began the de-emphasis of busing with the passage of the publication of The Nation at Risk. In light of fallen market share, fallen economic productivity, high rising unemployment in some cases. What was it, like close to 14%, depending on subgroup. Decline in profit, more importantly. A spike in domestic violence, violent crime, a spike in political apathy, lack of confidence in political leaders. I suppose Watergate and Iran-Contra be damned. The Secretary of Education, I think at the time, was Bill Bennett. I may be wrong about that in 1983, but Bill Bennett was on. William Bennett was on the Nation at Risk report, or part of it. The federal officials maintained in the Nation at Risk report that while education wasn't the sole cause of these social problems, it was at least an important cause, significant cause, and that and Reagan maintained that perhaps we have attempted to use his words, we have attempted to paraphrase his word, we've attempted to do too much in too little time. That we've attempted to equalize, we've put all our emphasis on equality and equity and not enough on excellence. And that has led to not pushing the brightest of the bright, and therefore this has led to these other social consequences, particularly falling productivity, falling market share, falling profit. And so the emphasis at the federal level, at least, changed, which had manifestations, which manifest in practical local terms. The emphasis was shifted to excellence and identifying, as measured by, of course, achievement scores, and emphasizing or cultivating excellence, perhaps at the expense of equality and equity. So the focus, and as a result, we as a country moved away from busing and integration in these types of issues. And then of course a spat of court cases these cases were around since 1970s, but these issues were around since 1970s. But starting with the Board of Education of Oklahoma City versus Dowell. I'll put these up here in a second. Freeman versus Pitts, and Board of Education versus Dowell in 1990, heard by the Supreme Court in 1991. Again, has its roots in the 1970s. Freeman versus Pitts in Atlanta, from Atlanta. DeKalb County was heard the next year in 1992 by the Supreme Court, and Missouri versus Jenkins was heard in 1995. Again, all having the issue rooted in the 1970s desegregation. Here, I don't know if you can see this. I hope you can see this. Again, I apologize. And my scribble there doesn't help matters, I'm sure. I will put a link underneath this video. I'll list these court cases with some links to the briefs if I can find them. I've had trouble finding a couple of the briefs before. That is, not overviews, but I'm talking about the full PDF court decisions, I guess is what the major opinions. I'll try to find that. Those three cases, while the particulars in each case are different, there are nuances for sure, and you can look these up via Wikipedia or whatever you want to do. You could probably find the full brief and decision. I'll try to do so here in a second. These court cases, starting with the Oklahoma City versus Dowell case, Freeman versus Pitts, and to some degree Missouri versus Jenkins, the Supreme Court ruled on and in favor of, ruled on the issue of absolving local school districts from mandatory compliance with desegregation laws. The Oklahoma City, this is true in every one of those cases, but the school boards in Oklahoma City, DeKalb County, Kansas City, in their own way, again, according to their own particulars, argued that they acted in good faith. They attempted in good faith to comply with the federal desegregation orders and have done everything in their power to create a unitary and equal system of education. Even though some inequality and inequity still exist, district courts agreed with them and absolved them from desegregation order, mandatory compliance with desegregation orders, and the Supreme Court confirmed, or I don't know, what do? You agreed with the district court orders. So that has led, and I think Orange County here was absolved from mandatory compliance with federal desegregation orders. I don't know, was it been 10 years or something like that? Maybe not 10 years, 7 to 10 years, something like that. And it's left people to say, what do we do? I mean, even people who are sympathetic to Kozol's concern here, who agree with Kozol, argue, look, the Supreme Court had its say. This is a situation that we find ourselves in. We have to do something. We gotta do the best we can. Now, I failed to mention that the Rodriguez case, or appeal to the Rodriguez case, is often used as a justification, as Kozol would see it. Those who say, look, Rodriguez Rodriguez had the final say, was the final say in this equity issue. Let's get over it and do what we can. And some would argue that Kozol would argue that that has happened with these three cases here. People would simply just give up on desegregation altogether as an important goal to be achieved by a democratic society. Well, and so it has left scholars and those academicians who educators, teachers, and to some degree legislators who advocate for vouchers, who advocate for magnet types of programs, and so on. One other thing that Kozol points out, and he points out a couple things, but one other thing that's important, he said, again, drawing on Gary Orfield, we can expand, we can put qualifications on the housing voucher. HUD, Housing Urban Development, issues a voucher, a housing voucher, or a certificate for people who are in poverty or a certain percentage of the poverty line. Of course, the amount varies according to income, what people are capable of, the financial resources that people are capable of generating. But the federal government will issue a certificate, or basically a voucher, that will help people pay for housing costs in places that are willing to accept it, of course. And what Kozol, again, he's repeating what other people's arguments as well, Orfield being one, and several federal, U.S. Congress people who have said, look, we can put qualifications on that housing voucher such that if someone has a domicile or house rental to rent to the public, then they have to take, by federal law, they have to take or accept that housing voucher. What that does, they argue, is it allows people to have more economic choice than what they ordinarily would have, and thus be able to integrate into neighborhoods and therefore into schools within those neighborhoods where they'd like their children to go. That, of course, that proposal has been met with significant opposition, and you probably will know why. That's a matter of money. Well, people immediately argue, look, the government's going to tell me what to do with my private property. I work hard for this, and I'm not just simply going to let a government tell me what I can and can't do with it. That would be anti-democratic, anti-capitalist, anti-democratic. And this is America after all, they have argued. There was a similar, if you look at the Rumsford Fair Housing Act, you just simply Google Rumsford Fair Housing Act in the 1960s. 1963, I think, the Rumsford Fair Housing Act. I think William Rumsford, I think was his name. I may be wrong his first name. Was a representative in the California State Legislature from, I want to say, the San Francisco, Oakland area. He represented that area, and he argued or helped get sponsored legislation in State of California. I think it was Proposition 14. maybe I'm wrong. You can look this up. That made it a crime to discriminate on the basis of race. Anyone who was renting to the public cannot discriminate and on the basis of race, and of course it passed. But immediately as it passed, the various real estate associations came out against it. Lobbied against lobbied for the repeal of that act. And the arguments, of course, were based upon economics. That's and primarily the issue of private property and what one should be able to do with his or her private property. The very next year, that Rumsford Fair Housing Act was repealed. That has led some scholars to say that it was the impetus or precipitated the Watts riots in California in 1965. Nevertheless, that's one approach. It would allow people to have more economic choice than they normally have. I'll go through two traditional approaches. Well, actually, there's three. There are three other approaches. I'm running out of time here. I found that if I get close to an hour, it's easier for me to load. So I'm going to stop this right now and start another a follow-up video, or another video right after this, and I'll get at the three other approaches I want to identify.